Islamic philosophy too, we will look at now the second half of Islamic philosophy, and here we will look at two other Islamic philosophers and what they've had to say about education under the Islamic perspective and their contributions as well. So the first one here is Ibn Khaldun. According to him, major contribution was in history of philosophy and sociology, and wrote about the history of the world. Now here we see that philosophy is branching out into sociology. Over here we begin to see that philosophy, which was an individual's job, leads to society, which is people living together in harmony, in tolerance of one another, in peace, and trying to learn from one another, trying to help one another, trying to gain from one another's experiences, and so on. And so sociology comes out to be. So from the single-minded philosophy leads to a multi-minded sociology of education. Now, when we think that so many years ago, it was the Muslims that gave this all to the field of education. Today, then, why are we dependent on the West? Why do we look to the West? We had it all. Where have we lost it? It is time we turned around. It is time we stopped and asked ourselves, where have we lost it? How can we regain what we had? We had all that. We gave this to the Western world. They learned it from us. And today, we are dependent on them. That is a shame. Wrote about the history of the world. At that time, when Ibn Khaldun did this, the world was a much limited space. Okay? But even then, at that time, to write about the history of the world, it wasn't the history of the area where he was living or the immediate neighbors. It's the history of the world. So he did do a lot of surveying, lot of finding out, skills that today we would like to teach young people in our schools and institutions. His great works were A Universal History and a summary of the result, which is religion. So history and religion. Now, when you look at these two things, you might think of them as being opposites, but they are not. Under the Islamic perspective, history, Islamic history, and religion, which is Islam, go together. So we have to look at everything under the Islamic perspective as being two sides of the same coin. Religion on one side, and whatever else we are trying to teach. Jurisprudence, law, medicine, math, history, language, literature, going together under what Islam guides and wants us to teach our young children. The next philosopher that we're looking at is Al-Farabi. Now, his major contribution is in philosophy, logic, and sociology. Now, again, to me, these three things are important. Philosophy and logic kind of go together because they make you think. They make you use your own head. Now, when we look at philosophical aspects of things, we are looking at how an individual perceives those things, notions, concepts, ideas, events, happenings, whatever they may be. Because we all have our own philosophies, we have our own way of thinking about these things. And that was encouraged at that time. It wasn't meant that everybody had to think the same. The whole class did not have to give the teacher's response or what the teacher said or what they read in the textbooks. It was open. The students were encouraged to use their own heads and contribute their understanding, their suggestions, their recommendations, their opinions to make learning much more fruitful. His great works are Kitab al-Hisa al-Ulum, explains the classification and principles of basic science, and a book on music. Now, science and music, when one person does that, you can see how education and the areas of study were integrated. And that is what we need to do today. We need to integrate education for our young people to give them a better understanding of what they are doing in our classrooms. Having looked at the 4 Islamic philosophers and what they've had to say, and having seen part of their contributions towards education and learning, let us look at some of the common elements among the 3 philosophers. The first thing that you see is that all of them went in to teach more than just religion, literature, and the history or happenings, events of the time. All 4 of them emphasized integrated teaching and learning, not teaching independent disciplines, but trying to put 3-4 disciplines together and teach in a holistic manner. Third thing that we see is that they allowed students to think wherever they were. There were no classrooms at that time, but whenever these people got together, they allowed people to open up their minds, to speak their thoughts, and to help learn from one another, which was a strong element in education at that time, opposed to depending on learning from only one individual's ideas and knowledge base. So the question then arises, is it information? Is it knowledge? Or much more? What is it that we are looking for in education? Certainly, you cannot doubt that information is important. Information has to be provided or shared. Depends on what kind of philosophy you believe in about education. If you believe in an autocratic philosophy, you will give information. If you believe in a democratic philosophy, you will probably share information. But what happens with that information? When does information become knowledge? Information is all the bits and pieces of data that you collect, that you have. Knowledge is, of those bits and pieces of data that you've collected, what do you actually use? That becomes knowledge for you. And that is why people who become doctors focus differently, people who become engineers focus differently, people who become computer scientists focus differently. The information base is the same, but the knowledge base is different. So, today, in the 21st century, we have lots of information. We are actually drowning in information. How much of that information really does one need to transform into knowledge for oneself so that I or that individual can benefit? That depends on person to person. The individual is the only one who can actually stress whether this information is good for him or not. Does he need that? Does he need all of it? How much of it he needs? So let's leave that to the students to decide. Let us not force them to study what we would think is important for them. Let them decide what is important for themselves as individuals. The second thing here in closing is, hikmah is an abundant and huge gift of God. It shows us how to use knowledge. God has given human beings a brain that functions, and that is what differentiates human beings from other animals. Animals have a brain, but it's not functional. Human beings have a brain and it's functional. And so, if we can use that gift of God to help us find our standing in life, to find out for ourselves what is it that I need to do, what is it that God wants me to do, what is the purpose of my being alive today, that will help answer lots of questions about the information overload and the knowledge base that unique individual students will need to make their lives better for themselves and society.